Sometimes it seems like every 5 minutes. So this is what we know as of today. Specific, especially the last section of the training is going to focus on evictions and housing concerns under COVID-19. Holly, if you want, we'll wait a minute or two unless you know that everybody who had planned to be on is on.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll wait just a few minutes and see.
Okay. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and start screen sharing for folks.
Okay, sounds good. You just let me know when you want to get started. So.
Sounds good. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today's training is just an overview of housing and homeless issues. And just briefly, I want to touch on who I am as it relates and who the Homeless and Housing Coalition is. So we're a statewide advocacy organization. In addition to operating statewide AmeriCorps and Vista Homes for All programs, we advocate for nonpartisan housing policies on behalf of low-income Kentuckians at both the federal and the state levels of government. And we also provide permanent supportive housing to chronically homeless households. We have been around since 1987. So a question we get a lot is, what is affordable housing? That is a term that comes with a lot of different connotations, but its simplest definition is that it's a home that costs only 30% of monthly adjusted gross income, including utilities. So ideally, we want everybody to have affordable housing and not be paying more than 30% of their monthly income on rent / mortgage / utilities. So there are a couple of perspectives on the need for affordable housing, that it's not specific to any one city or any one state, although we do have some real high cost areas. And it's also a problem that both sides of the political aisle can agree that there is an issue. Now, there may be disagreement on what the solutions are, but for what it's worth, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see something that says the federal government never developed a national plan to coordinate the construction of affordable housing where it was needed or required any city to construct it. And it never successfully challenged the notion that housing was a commodity, not a right. So that's from The Nation, typically left views on the political spectrum. And then from the Heritage Foundation, which is on the right side of the spectrum, they talk about their concern around home prices and how they were rising almost in the same pattern they displayed leading into the 2008 housing crash. And right now, the way our federal housing policy is structured, it seems like the goal is to get as much mortgage debt into the system as possible, which is, in their words and mine, a recipe for disaster. So for reference sake, you should know that about 64% of Americans are homeowners, or they don't have, they're not in a lease and they don't have rent. And then that leaves about 35% of Americans who are home renters. 38 million American households spent more than 30% on their housing costs in 2016. So that's a lot of people, right? And the source of this is the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University. Sometimes we get asked, who is more cost burdened? Are homeowners more cost burdened? Are renters? And what we find is when you control for income, a similar proportion of low-income homeowners and renters are severely cost burdened. So if you are low income, chances are you are paying well above 50% of your monthly income on your housing, which is not sustainable. 66% in this extremely low income group of homeowners are paying more than 30%, 70% of renters. We also get asked, who are these extremely low income renters? They're folks who are working service sector jobs. They are folks who are permanently disabled and cannot work. They are retired folks. And so what we know in Kentucky is for every 100 extremely low income households in Kentucky, there are only 53 rental homes that are actually affordable to them. Another way to look at this is, what does it actually cost in terms of wages to afford a 2-bedroom? This is last year's number. I forgot to update it. It's actually $14.99 per hour to afford a 2-bedroom unit. You would have to be working full time. If you have somebody who's working at a minimum wage job, they would need to be working at least 63 hours per week. Closer this year is closer to about 66 hours. So I just want you to think about the types of jobs that we have that pay low wages, and whether you could realistically get 63 hours per week in a minimum wage job, and also think about the types of jobs that are available and what their starting range is, whether it's $15 or more. Another question we get is the affordable housing crisis urban or rural? And the answer is it's both. In the left-hand map, you can see really high-cost areas, as I referenced earlier, Seattle, Los Angeles, San Francisco, out in the, on the West Coast, on the East Coast. You see Boston, New York, New Jersey, the DC metro area. All of those, you have housing prices are out of control. You have high rates of literal unsheltered homelessness. But this right-hand map actually shows that the affordability crisis is spreading to rural America. You can see kind of where my arrow is, I'm hovering over Kentucky, and especially like Appalachian Kentucky, Southwest Virginia. Those rental markets are starting to get a lot tighter too. Nationwide homelessness remains an issue, and it has since the 1980s for various reasons. On a single night in 2018, about 500,000 people were experiencing literal homelessness. These are folks who are staying in shelters, or they're in unsheltered locations, such as on the street. Oops. Sorry, my mouse is getting a little excited here. In abandoned buildings or other places not suitable for human habitation. Here in Kentucky, it may manifest in like encampments on riverbanks and parking garages, that sort of thing. So how did we get here? The country was founded in, the late 1700s, but it wasn't until the U.S. Housing Act of 1937 that the federal government really even started to play any sort of role in housing, other than, I do want to back up and say, obviously we gave land, we gave other things to folks to go out and settle the country and conquer and all of that sort of thing. But in terms of federal laws and federal programs, the federal government really started getting involved in 1937. 30 years later, you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that established basic civil rights for people of different colors and races and ethnicities. And going along with that, the administration at the time felt that a federal cabinet addressing housing was imperative to address civil rights. And so then following that, 3 years later, after the creation of HUD, you have the Fair Housing Act. Kentucky passed its own Fair Housing Act later. And then in the 1970s, we have the Housing Community Development Act under the Nixon administration that really tried to, that's where you see the beginning of like the Section 8 / Housing Choice Voucher program that we have today. And then later in the 1980s, as I mentioned, we really didn't have wide-scale homelessness and housing affordability issues until the mid-1980s. And so that's when you see the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And that's the act that funds a lot of the programs that our shelters use to this day. In the 1990s, we had the Cranston-Gonzalez National Affordable Housing Act that created the Home Investment Partnerships Program, which a lot of Kentucky providers use, particularly for construction of single-family homes, as well as multifamily development. And then today, HUD continues to shape the housing environment by federal rulemaking. We haven't had a major federal law since the reauthorization of the McKinney-Vento Act. But in the meantime, they were doing all kinds of rulemaking, which sounds innocuous, but for those of you who aren't familiar with administrative law, once an agency issues a federal rule, it becomes basically administrative law. So right now, there are a couple of things. They've have rolled back protections with the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, in the process of rolling back equal access to shelters, and lots of other fun things. Okay, and then after that, we had the Great Recession that really has shaped the housing market substantially over the past decade or so. It really hit people who were homeowners at that time. A lot of folks went back from homeowning to renting, and a lot of rental property kind of sprung up. And now I think we're going to get to it at the end, but I think we're poised to have another big shift after COVID-19. I want to talk briefly about housing tax expenditures. So tax expenditures are things that it's when a government issues a law, makes a law that basically gives some sort of credit or abatement or break to an industry or a group of people. A lot of people don't know that like employer-sponsored insurance, health insurance is a big tax break actually, because that is not taxable. But another big housing tax, or another big tax expenditure that we don't often recognize, but really shapes all of our housing policy, is the Mortgage Interest Deduction Act. So again, from the Heritage Foundation, this time on the left, this is what we're talking about when we federally back really large mortgages and encourage people to take on more debt because the interest is tax deductible. That's revenue that the federal government doesn't receive, and it actually may encourage people to purchase more house than they can realistically afford. In 2015 alone, we gave away $71 billion in foregone tax revenue by deducting mortgage interest. So keep that figure in mind, 71 billion, okay? There's another type of housing tax expenditure that we're generally bigger fans of, and that's the low-income housing tax credit. Its cost is about $9 billion annually, but it has built about 2 million units across the country. Credits are awarded through state housing finance agencies in Kentucky. That, of course, is Kentucky Housing Corporation. Okay, so this is a budget chart from last year, and I picked these programs. These are programs that are federally funded and that a lot of agencies where you all are serving for the year, they may be utilizing these funds. So the Community Development Block Grant first, Home Investment Partnerships Program we talked about, homeless assistance grants, that sort of thing. You can see, okay, if we gave away $71 billion in 2015, that doesn't leave a whole lot for direct spending. So in CDBG, we only spent $3.3 billion nationwide. In home, only $1.25 billion. For homeless assistance grants, which includes continuum of care and emergency solutions grants, it was $2.6 billion. So that's quite a bit less than what we're giving away. Other programs that you may become familiar with over the course of the year include the USDA Rural Housing Service, and perhaps weatherization and LIHEAP. And then there's a third section where the federal government gets directly involved, and that's through the Federal Housing Finance Administration, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, primarily. So I want to go back real quick. You see housing choice vouchers. Those are your vouchers referred to as Section 8 vouchers, most likely. And you can see there was about $22.5 billion allocated in fiscal year 2019 for that. Here's the problem with that. It doesn't actually cover that amount of money, as large so it may be, doesn't actually cover all the folks who are eligible for it. And so that's why you will see long waiting lists that remain closed, point systems to prioritize and target resources. Hang on a second, I'm going to close my door. Okay. The next challenge that we had been seeing prior to COVID-19, and we're about to see a whole heck of a lot more, is evictions. The third is ability to use vouchers. Sometimes if somebody comes with a voucher, landlords may not accept it because they may not want to have a housing quality standards inspection, or they don't like the paperwork, or they think it's it's just too much regulation, or they may actually have a very real implicit bias about who has the housing voucher. So that's a challenge. Another is just overall federal environment and the Budget Control Act and sequestration. And this was federal act about 8 years ago that put into motion some budget caps that really limit the federal government's ability to provide direct spending on domestic programs like these. Concentration of poverty and segregated housing and developing new units and preserving aging units. So 40, 50 years ago, you saw a lot of public housing complexes, and then there was a move towards deconcentrating poverty through the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And then but the issue has been when you do large developments like that, you do end up, as a consequence, concentrating low-income folks all together. And if we're talking about upward mobility and local choice, it's difficult. It's also difficult when we are preserving buildings, particularly through the low-income housing tax credit program. If we have long-standing patterns of segregation and redlining and concentration of poverty, but at the same time, we need all the housing units we can get, how do we negotiate those two things? In Kentucky, we have an aging housing stock, particularly in our rural communities. Not as many new home starts since the year 2000, and just housing that needs repaired, needs substantial work, especially as our populations get older. We really need to think about accessibility and making sure people can age in place. Another challenge is that unsheltered homelessness is actually trending upward, according to the most recent point-in-time count data through 2019. And then at the local level, you may see regulatory barriers to creating new housing. Lots of restrictive zoning and other legal mechanisms to keep out new development of extremely affordable housing. This is from a presentation I did, or paper I did not too long ago, and pretty much all these things are still true. We just have a shortage of safe, decent, and affordable housing options for low and moderate income households. There are three broad categories of housing, regardless of income level. You've got owner-occupied, which is typically single-family home ownership, rental units, rental homes, and then manufactured housing. So in Kentucky, we talked, okay, nationwide, about 64% are homeowners. In Kentucky, it's a little bit higher, although it does depend on local conditions. You'll see in college towns, some of our smaller cities, they may have higher percentages or ratios of home renters to homeowners. The other interesting note here is that 12.3% of units are manufactured housing, which is about double the national average. Okay, so some context for you. The map on the left talks about population, really pretty graphically demonstrates that Kentucky is overall a pretty rural state. You know, we have urban concentrations of people in Jefferson County, Louisville, Fayette County, Lexington, and the surrounding communities like Georgetown, Richmond, etc. And then northern Kentucky. But overall, Kentucky is pretty rural. The right-hand map demonstrates where our pockets of extreme poverty are. And you can see, not surprisingly, in the eastern part of the state, Appalachian Kentucky experiences really persistent impoverished levels. And then out there in far western Kentucky as well. So as I said before, some of these environmental factors that affect housing are poverty, especially persistent poverty, and especially in the eastern part of the state. Wage stagnation. Since the official resolution of the Great Recession in 2012 rather, Kentucky wages have essentially remained stagnant. They have less purchasing power than they did in 2007. Labor force participation is materially lower than the national average, and the combination of lower incomes and actual earned wages tend to make housing less affordable to households, regardless of actual housing costs. We touched on this briefly, but Kentucky's housing stock is aging. Our median value of our housing is lower than the national average. The median age has increased, while nationally it seems to be getting lower. And then the Housing Assistance Council reports that 28.4% of our units here in Kentucky are inadequate housing. And that may be a combination of incomplete plumbing, kitchen facilities, overcrowding, or cost burdens. Okay, I want to talk about rental need in Kentucky. We have about 28% of our renters who are extremely low income, so they are at or below 30% of the area median income. So the maximum income of somebody at that level is about $25,000 annually for 4 people in a household. Looking at those numbers, we have a shortage of rental homes that are affordable and available to folks of about 75,000 units. Okay, we already have a housing crisis, and then we have the pandemic hit, so that's fun. This is 31,000 and some change is what's needed to afford a 2-bedroom rental home at HUD's fair market rent. And then, as we talked about before, we've got our extremely low-income renters have severe cost burden, which means they're paying more than 50% of their income. If they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing, 84% of those folks, or us, because they're us, are in that category. So homelessness in Kentucky. We looked at the national level, it's about 500,000 people, and I mentioned that unsheltered homelessness is trending upward. So every January, Kentucky counts, and most jurisdictions across the country count the number of people experiencing literal homelessness, whether that's in shelter or out on the street or in a cave or wherever. And so you can see from this graph, since we started getting decent data in about 2013, we had been making progress in terms of the number counted, and all the trend lines were going down up until between 2018 and 2019. We do not have the 2020 figures yet. Those should be interesting. But remember, it was also pre-pandemic. So the point-in-time count, in Kentucky, we call it the K count, but it is required by HUD for HUD-assisted programs to participate in it. So our Homes for All members assist with this count, trying to make sure we're getting an accurate count across 118 counties. It's a challenge, but we're up for it. And so it's both, you look at the data you have, and then you try to actually be out in the community and try to make sure that you're touching everyone who's experiencing homelessness. And there are essentially 3 counts that are done usually right on the same night within the same 24-hour period. And that is the balance of state continuum of care, where it's called the K count. In Lexington, the continuum of care, they call it the Lex count. And in Louisville, they call it the street count. Okay. A few years ago, HUD went to a system that they call coordinated entry or common assessment. So anyone who's experiencing literal homelessness should theoretically go through this process when it's trying to access help. So in Lexington, you would, if somebody who is homeless contacts you, direct them to 211. In Louisville, they have a shelter reservation bed hotline, and all the shelters participate in common assessment. So it's here. And then everywhere else, it's complicated. In the 118 counties that exclude Fayette and Jefferson, there is a system called Any Door Kentucky, and that I'll say it's loosely a system. Each region that matches up with the area development district has a HUD-funded provider who it manages the coordinated entry process or list for that region. So theoretically, anyone who's a HUD-funded provider, and hopefully those who aren't in a region, will be conducting those assessments, getting them into the system, and then the coordinated entry lead will be then assigning referrals to get people vouchers and get people housed. So the overall housing need in Kentucky, if you look at home ownership cost burden, about 20% overall, and that's across income. Rental cost burden across income is about 50%, and so overall about 28%. And we also have a significant amount of individuals experiencing literal homelessness. So our estimate is about 26% of folks in Kentucky are housing insecure, which if you look at our population of about 4.4 million, the bottom line is that 1 in 4 Kentuckians are housing insecure. Okay. The next section, the last section, is housing in the time of Corona. You can see that I've thrown a couple of images up here. One is a wrench. It's definitely put a wrench into a system that was only somewhat functional before. And then we have a wave to represent the potential wave or tsunami of evictions that may be forthcoming from all of our households who have lost income over the past few months and have been unable to make their rent due to no fault of their own. So housing in the time of Corona, you can see the unemployment numbers in Kentucky. In my lifetime, I think about the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, and you can see like the dip in the of folks who were employed during that time. That was huge, and it was very painful. And then you come over here and you look at the unemployment numbers from the first part of this year, and it's hard to believe. even though I look at this chart fairly regularly. So you can see, even though we have started, some companies have brought people back, you can see we're still not anywhere close to where we were prior to the COVID-19 hitting. The other thing to note is that a lot of these jobs were service sector, and a lot of people were underemployed to begin with, so they may not have had like one full-time job, but they would have had, a couple of jobs. And if you lost one, like, yes, technically you're still employed, but like you lost at least a third of your income. So nationwide, it looks like about 30 to 40 million of Americans are at risk of eviction. And the question is, who will get hurt? Pretty much everyone. So studies have shown that evictions affect Black and Latinx renters at much higher rates than white people for a lot of reasons, okay? Whether it's implicit bias on the part of the judge or the landlord, or is it just simple like wealth and network resources that you can draw on when you get into a tight spot. Renters with children are also more likely to be forced out of their homes than single folks are. So there's an article here from the Washington Post that may be helpful for you in explaining why it seems like a perfect storm of factors are all coming together. In Kentucky, we estimate that nearly half of Kentucky renters are at risk of eviction. On the right-hand map, you can kind of see where we are. And this is according to a firm of people who are much smarter and have better resources than I have to do data collection. And they estimate that 48% of folks who rent are at risk. The left-hand chart was done by a friend of mine at the Kentucky Center for Economic Policy, and of those folks, this was at the beginning of July. At that time, we were thinking about a quarter of folks were at risk, but of that quarter, at least, or over half, were Black Kentuckians. So we know how this, if this crisis goes on, who it's going to impact. Louisville Metro and Metro Louisville, or Metro Louisville United Way, rather, there has been tracking their 211 data. And remember, they do have a 211. We do not have a statewide 211. But I thought this was an interesting data point. Of all the 211 calls in Louisville Metro, the largest share so far is 35%, and that is for housing and shelter. And of the housing and shelter calls, 64% is for rent assistance, which is crazy. So right now, I think we all are probably getting inundated with questions about what is available right now, because theoretically, the federal government passed all this great assistance at the end of March through the CARES Act, and yet nobody can seem to get a hold of the actual cash to make things work. So statewide, all counties minus Louisville, Jefferson County, there theoretically will be $15 million in CARES Act state funding that was designated by Governor Beshear at the end of August. This application portal is to open on 9/9, so I don't have a link for it yet because it's not live. In Lexington, a little bit less than $1.5 million was made available in Emergency Solutions Grant and Community Development Block Grant Fund, and they do have a county-wide portal for renters in Lexington and Fayette County. In Louisville, $21 million in rental assistance was designated in July. They have a portal there called stopmyeviction.org. And then in the other 118 counties where many of you are serving, we expect that there will be about $10 million in rapid rehousing dollars or vouchers for literally homeless folks. We expect that will be allocated regionally. Again, key here is it's not here yet. Okay. And then operations funding for shelters, that application is now open through Kentucky Housing Corporation. Legal resources. So our colleagues at the Kentucky Equal Justice Center have been really critical throughout this whole pandemic, and they have developed a rental app that's designed for about 3 different audiences. One is the Kentuckian who rents your home, and another is for attorneys who are helping Kentuckians who are facing evictions. And then the last part of the platform, which hasn't been quite built out yet, is anyone who wants Kentucky renters to have more rights. Now, I want to urge you to be careful as you are national service members, right? So if you are all fired up after this presentation and you're like, I'm going to go sign up for this, please, please, please do not do it on the time you are, like, your official time serving. Do it after hours. Please don't use your service email, place of service email address. Please use your personal one. You as a national service member can advocate and get involved in these things, but you need to do it on your own time, and definitely not as someone who represents AmeriCorps or VISTA, okay? Lastly, I did this presentation, I put together this presentation or this PowerPoint yesterday morning, and by yesterday afternoon, things had already changed on the eviction front. You may be aware that the Centers for Disease Control the CDC, has taken its authority to issue a nationwide eviction moratorium effective on September 4th. This eviction moratorium should cover renters who are being evicted or at risk of eviction for non-payment of rent. And unlike the CARES Act moratorium, it would cover all rental situations, not just federally backed ones. There's still a lot of questions about it because it's written very broadly. And so information changes daily, it feels like, if not hourly. But just know that this has been ordered by the federal government in the absence of congressional action. If you run into folks who they have an eviction notice or they're worried about being evicted, this app that the Kentucky Equal Justice Center has put together now includes an update that allows the renter to fill out and print out a declaration saying that they make less than $99,000 a year, that they are at risk for non-payment, and they lost income due to COVID-19. So the renter has to, the burden is on the renter to do that part. But we're obviously keeping our eye out on this really closely and doing as much analysis as we can, right, in real time. As we get better information from our national partners and our legal friends, we will do our best to get information out to you. And if you ever have any questions, you feel free to reach out to Holly, reach out to Caitlin, reach out to me, whoever. So my contact information is here. And you can always follow us on Facebook or Twitter. And I know you are all already following the Homes for All page on Facebook and Instagram. But this is for the HHCKY handle. It covers a lot of policy issues and larger organization issues if you're interested in that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions you all have in the remaining time that we have.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you guys, you feel free to either unmute yourself or you can write your questions in the chat box, whichever way works best.
I have rendered you all speechless. And now you all are housing experts and could give this presentation yourself. That's great. Or everybody is just meetinged out. I totally get that too. Yes, Holly, feel free to send out a copy of the PowerPoint for folks.
Yeah, for sure. We'll upload it to the HHCK website.
Oh, perfect.
That way everybody
you
can.
You guys are so on top of this. This
Yeah.
is why we love our Homes for All staff so much, because they give you all such good information, and they put it in really accessible places.
Yeah, thanks. Anybody else have anything they want to talk about?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, again, thanks for listening through that. And you will have a copy of the slides available to you. And reach out to us as you have questions, especially if there is no dumb question in housing and homelessness, for one thing, because nothing actually makes sense to the average person. So please, reach out to us as you have questions, as you come across situations. This is a really scary time for a lot of us, a lot of our neighbors, a lot of our family and friends whom we care about. And I'm grateful to you all for committing to this year of national service, because I think you will be able to just be a really big support to a lot of people in your community. And we here at Homes for All and HHCK are here to support you in that effort.
Yes. I will say before we hop off, for those of you that participated today, you can log 1 hour for Homes for All training on your timesheets. So don't forget to do that. And we will get it uploaded to our website, and we will talk to everyone soon.
Thanks so much, y'all. It was good to hang out virtually.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrienne.
All right. Bye.
Bye.